Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, folks. Whenever you're listening to this show, welcome back to another episode of Sultans and Sneakers. I'm your host, as always, Maheen, the podcaster. The show we talk about why people believe what they believe. We ask the why behind it, and I'm joined today by chaplain Tricia Pethic. Tricia, thank you very much for coming on the show today.
Thanks so much for having me.
Well, the topic today is going to be compassionate conservatism. And I think Tricia, you and I, as I meet a lot of my guests on Twitter or Facebook, and I have found you as somebody who was, positioning views that are considered by the everyday person to be normal, you would say. But then people today, I feel like we have a trend where the normal is now the abnormal, or in some cases the bigoted. And I know we'll get to that. But to start, I wanted to just get to know you a little bit. Where did you grow up? How would you, I guess, describe yourself as like maybe a 16-year-old teenager in high school?
Sure. My father is from a long line of, sort of came over on the Mayflower type, Americans from England. Kind of typical storyline. And my mother is actually a first generation American. And so I was born to, a family of Democrats, but that being said, being a Democrat back then was a very different thing. I would say my upbringing, I was never raised in a particular form of Christianity. There were shades of Catholicism. I went to Catholic high school, actually. So being back then, being a Democrat and having views like, hey, maybe abortion should be, kind of rare and only resorted to in an emergency was an okay thing for a Democrat.
Right.
So I was in a Catholic school. I was like any other teenager, I suppose, but I've always been sort of quiet, but able to speak my mind when I feel I really have to. So that's who I was as a teenager.
Were your parents like card-carrying Democrats, you would say, or were they just like nominally? They weren't crazy about it. They just necessarily did, but you knew they voted blue every election.
Well, my parents were, neither of them had college degrees, so they were kind of very working class people.
Okay.
So I was the big news watcher of the family because I had the time to do it. Mm-hmm. And I would discuss with my parents the different candidates, and much of the time they would actually vote based on what I told them. So I think I was kind of always seen like the brain of the family, and they wanted me to go on and get a college degree and all of these things. So there were a lot of expectations that I think maybe a lot of children of immigrants can relate to out there.
Right. I think not to like let people like guess your age or anything, but I would have to assume that you're probably coming up in the age during the era of, Bill Clinton as the president, Newt Gingrich on the Republican side. And I didn't follow politics too much back then, but what were the issues that you remember, I guess, in the 90s that like got your attention, that like maybe was like, hey, I think I agree with this? What were some of the hot button topics you think that you were aligned on?
Well, as I recall, the first major political sort of uproar or issue was the whole Clinton-Lewinsky affair. And I remember distinctly having a class trip to Washington, D.C. during that whole thing, and members of my class just kind of saying taunting things like in front of the White House. And I just remember thinking, even at that age, how sad it was that we had fallen to the point where we were like able to stand in front of the White House as like middle schoolers and sort of make fun of the president for the things that he did. But so my introduction to politics and political issues was a very controversial time. Mm-hmm. And an incident that I think a lot of Democrats would rather forget and play down. But I think the way that as we saw with Trump, the way that our leaders behave is very much an important matter that we should care about the character of our presidents.
My parents at the time, I was Lewinsky Clinton trial, I would have been a junior in high school. So I remember my parents had a subscription. I think it was Time Magazine or Newsweek, and as typical like immigrant parents, when the Star report came out, the details were in the magazines. They like tried to hide it from because I would read every week, but then when that one came out, I think my dad tried to like hide it, but he was too late because of the detail, the kind of the graphic details. Assuming I knew nothing as a 16-year-old high school junior, right? But I remember in school, you bring up an interesting point because I think in high school, for me, and it seems like I'm a few years older than you, based upon what you said being in middle school at the time. I think, there was a ton of a tendency to try to encourage us to try to, think about politics, but it wasn't like in your face. It doesn't. It seems like at least today's kids, and I don't have kids that age, but I feel like they are maybe more aware of certain things. But back then, I remember or Bob Dole was running for president in '96, and they took us to a Bob Dole rally in Ohio. I know nothing about Bob Dole. When Clinton was under trial for the Lewinsky scandal, one of my classmates said something about like, hey, I only don't want him to get impeached because I don't want Al Gore to be president or something. And I wasn't sure why, like, she made that statement because I knew nothing about like what their politics were, because these issues of guns and granted, I went to high school and probably is a more conservative Republican area, right? Ohio, as you know, is a split state. But where I was, I would assume just based on financial, it was a wealthier suburb from where I attended high school. So I think I would have to assume that they would be more Republican. And back then, the social issues at the time that we have today, I don't know that it was really a hot button. I mean, it was very normal to be able to say the three letter F word in school publicly, and no one really thought of it. You know what I mean? So what point in time did you start, like, your parents, like Democrats, you mentioned, very different back then. It's more like the working class Democrat party. But when you and I talk, I think we were talking offline. One of the things that I think you appreciated was the Democrats, I guess, they're being the party of the working class and looking out for the socially, the economically, I would say, unprivileged or disadvantaged folks, right? Was that? Do you recall that as being a strong point for you, as why you maybe kind of identify with the Democrats early on?
Well, to a certain point, we all identify with what we were exposed to as kids, right?
Right.
Until we question it. But it wasn't always a given that we were going to vote for a Democrat. I remember thinking naively at the time that Bush was much more, could identify much more with Bush than with
Clinton or Gore. Yeah, right.
And of course, today I know more about the issue, so I vote less on personality. But yeah, I mean, a lot of people would be surprised to know that despite my quote unquote conservative views on social issues, I campaigned really hard for Bernie Sanders, like really hard. And I spent, hundreds of hours volunteering for him because I felt like that we are an oligarchy. He was the only one willing to call it what it was. And I think that people are suffering and in part turning to abortions because of our economic downturn as a country. And so it's a nuanced view to take. Like I'm pro-life, but I voted for Bernie Sanders. Well, nobody is going to completely encompass all of your views.
Right.
So, there's people who always critique pro-life people like, well, they're single issue voters. Well, to a certain degree, all of us are single issue voters because there always that one thing that's going to turn the tide for us, one person or another. So I just think nowadays there's so much tribalism, and social media has made it that way that we feel like we can't express even like a little bit of like, oh, gee, Mitt Romney seems like a nice guy. Like you can't even like say anything like that anymore.
Right.
Which is very sad.
Yeah. I think politicians, as much as we like to be critical of them, I mean, I think at the end of the day, and something I aim for my channel is always like, I think people ask me like, why do I interview certain people some people they think they're hideous or egregious, right? I'm like, at
Mhm.
the end of the day, everyone's a human being, right? Now they are shaped by their upbringing, by their culture, their customs, and that formulates the worldview.
Mhm.
And it forces them. So like Adolf Hitler isn't born a Nazi, right? There's a he becomes one over time,
Correct.
right?
Yeah.
This came up again. Like, why did you interview? When I interviewed Richard Spencer?
Yes, your Twitter beef.
Yeah, right. That's like the gift that keeps on giving. I'm gonna capitalize on that for like a decade, probably. I almost should change my, they say some people have their middle name. I was like Maheen under quote Richard Spencer Islam or something. That's my thing. It's like it's literally all But I mean, I think that's the aim of the show, and I think I don't think it's okay. Like, it's one thing to say yes, Barack Obama droned all these parent things, but at the same time, when you see the guy on TV or if you interacted with them, I think
Right.
I'd feel like, oh, he's still he seems like a nice guy, like a guy I hang out with, right?
Right.
Or Trump or Bush or whoever. I think a lot of people vote on that. That's probably a base level. I think that's a not a sophisticated level of how you vote, because politicians in natural are going to be charismatic. They're going to be likable. And then you have to like go beyond that and look at the issues a little bit. But when you were like, I guess you said you were campaigning for Bernie.
Yes.
What were the issues that Bernie had that intrigued you? Like, I guess what drove that motivation?
Well, first of all, we forget that what he did in agreeing to run a campaign without sort of corporate donations
Mm-hmm.
and successfully, and to come out of nowhere as an almost anonymous person, unknown person against Hillary Clinton, and make as much money as he did, and to be able to launch such a huge campaign independent of those financial sources is a huge thing, and I hope we don't forget about it. His transparency on the state of politics and just being willing to call out the fact that, Hillary Clinton, why were you giving the speech behind closed doors? Like, can you release the transcripts? Like, to this day, she hasn't released the transcripts of what she was saying to the big banks when she got paid to, give speeches that none of us knows the content of. Just stuff like that, I think, was huge, and it made her a better candidate at the end of the day. So I really felt that he was genuine, he was authentic. In retrospect, I see certain issues with him, but at this point, I believe that the person who won was supposed to win, right?
Yep. Right.
Father Allah. It is what it is. But yeah, I don't. I think people won't believe me, but yes, I'm registered Democrat, but I'm like on the verge of just leaving because it's becoming a nut house, really.
Right. And I think that's an interesting. The Sometimes what happens is that you need to go extreme. When you go extreme, and I don't understand why the Democrats decided to, I guess, engage, like, go super woke left. Because I was talking to America as a country, I think, is historically a center right country. Um, People are gonna tolerate certain things, but then when it comes to issues that I think when they really start affecting like their children, right? For example, and maybe we can get into this and start talking about some of these issues. When I'm hearing a lot about public schools dictating how sex and gender and those kind of ethics are being taught in school. And
Mhm.
my friends who have kids, my kids are all like my youngest isn't in school yet, but my two older ones, my oldest she's in third grade, but she's at an all girls Islamic school. And then my middle kid is going to be a kindergartner there. And by the way, those people who are wondering why I'm wearing a blazer and shirt, that's not my normal getup. Number one, it's because I wanted to, honor my mentor and my master, Dr. Jordan Peterson, for his excellent interview this week. No, that's not why. But it's for I just got back from my daughter's my 4-year-old's pre-K graduation. She's going to kindergarten next year. So, but they're in Islamic schools, right? When I speak to my friends who got their kids in public schools, and it's not like, you remember when we were kids, your parents could opt you out of sex ed. Like you just didn't have to go. You could just go somewhere else. You go to library, you go to study hall, whatever.
Right.
Like those options are gone. It is being required now in many states. And I was talking to a friend of mine, who's actually also my mechanic, and he was telling me about how he's getting this, pushback at his public school, and my friend, he's a Muslim, and he says, hey, this goes against my religious values. I just don't want my kids hearing it. What's so hard about that? They can go do something else, right? I'm not telling you what you teach to other kids. That's not, but I don't want my kid learning it, right? And even that's become a problem where other parents are just caving in, like, oh, you're being a bigot, et cetera, et cetera. This whole idea of like using gender pronouns, all of a sudden it's become a fad. Like, I think it's like a fad almost, you know what I mean? Like, because it came out of nowhere, you know what I mean?
It did, and it's a fad, but I'm afraid it's not going to go anywhere because it's being institutionalized. Someone I know, went to a meeting and everybody had to say their pronouns first. Now, I don't know if there's a meeting of 20 people, I'm not going to remember your pronouns by the end, maybe I will, because if most people do appear as the gender that they are.
Right.
And, pronouns, I suppose, exist because it may not be apparent from how I look. I may look male, but I'm actually identifying as female in all of this. But I've been actually doing like an unofficial sort of exploration of why certain Muslims on LinkedIn are using pronouns. And, one of them got quite a bit defensive and the other one answered. But really it boiled down to being empathetic to other people. And that's where I think this compassionate conservative topic we're using for our conversation comes in, because the idea that I have to agree with your self-image to be empathetic is, I think, wrong. And I can give numerous examples why, but and this idea, by the way, has crept into my field of chaplaincy. This idea that non-judgmental presence, which I don't disagree with in theory, except that I think as chaplains, we can't be a blank moral canvas because we are not secular licensed mental health counselors. We are coming into the conversation with morality. Otherwise, why call yourself a chaplain? Just go be an LMHC, right?
What's a LMHC?
A licensed mental health counselor.
Okay. Yeah, chaplain automatically implies like some kind of religious framework, right?
It implies that I'm coming to you from a particular point of view. Now, I'm not there to give a sermon when you come to me to counsel, but I'm coming with a moralistic worldview. And by you choosing me to come to, that it tells me that you want an answer that is informed by a moralistic worldview. So I have an issue with a lot of chaplains who are starting to talk about exploring your truth or the client's truth, because if there's my truth and your truth and in his truth and her truth, and they're different, how is that the truth? I mean,
right.
Like this is just a Tawhidic principle. Mm-hmm. And so what we should be after is God's truth and how to make God's truth manifest in my life. And perhaps I have inclinations or desires or temptations that want to take me away from that truth. But it's about God's truth. It's not about necessarily my truth. So, one of my proudest moments as a chaplain was I had gathered the female inmates together to tell them that I was leaving after 5 years. And the inmate who was the most upset at me, I mean, she was almost angry at me that I was leaving, was a very masculine inmate. She presented herself as kind of the male and was known to be a lesbian, like told me that.
Okay.
And she knew that I knew, and et cetera. And she said to me, you know, I'm really worried about who the next chaplain will be, because she said that I maintained what Islam says about acting on homosexuality. And I say that very specifically, acting on homosexuality. She said, you maintain the teachings and I respect that. And you never reduce me to just my sexuality. You see me as more than just my sexuality. So she felt seen, as, you know, our woke friends like to say, by me. Mm-hmm. And there are people out there who know my views, and they can't imagine that that would be the case. But here she was. It was a testament to the fact that I had, alhamdulillah, managed to walk that tightrope of not affirming her actions or behavior, but still seeing her as a human being. And I think a lot of chaplains are feeling like it's uncomfortable, and it is. It's very uncomfortable to walk that tightrope, because you have people who want to shout you down, call you a bigot, report you to HR, report you to your boss, get you fired. I feel for my university chaplain colleagues, especially. Mm-hmm. But I would say that we have to have a line in the sand that we draw, so that if we have to cross that, if we're asked to cross that line one day, we say no, this far and no further. If we don't have that line in the sand, it's very dangerous. And I'm not saying this as someone who's never put myself on the line, because I literally left prison chaplaincy because I was asked to do something immoral and I didn't. So right. I know what it means to lose a position over a stance, but we have to do that. And it's about caring about these people. It's not about shutting them out or excluding them. You know, anyway, I'll let you go to the next question.
No, I think that's, you know, one of the things that I think a lot of people fail to realize is that disagreement doesn't mean hatred. And, you know, one of the things that really got my brain thinking a few years back about, and why I guess maybe one of the reasons why this channel exists, is because I would always think about, like, I would meet these committed Christians, and some of them, I mean, they're putting in work. I know there was some I've had on the channel before. They sacrificed their businesses. They took views that were not popular, and in some ways I would also argue that they weren't the most tactful in how they did things and stuff. But they said some things that were kind of, I would say, controversial is a light word, but they put themselves out there. But at the same time, I felt like we could have a conversation, because at least I knew that because like when I would meet Christians that would tell me, oh, we think that Islam, you know, the prophet is Muhammad. Yeah, he was probably he could have been a prophet, or I think you might be saved, or etc. and yada 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 yada. I'm like, but that contradicts what you yourself, I understand, believe in, right? So right. You're bending your own, like, faith or whatever to appease me in a sense. Now, and mm-hmm. when you press down, now not all, these are some like more liberal-minded Christians that, you know, where you're treading on perennialist philosophy. But when I would meet these like more hardcore evangelical types, they would say, no, if you don't accept Jesus, you're going to hell. Straight up. I'm like, I mean, I appreciate you actually saying that, because at least it tells me you've got some kind of concrete belief system.
Right.
I think you're wrong, but at least right. we can actually, and then as long as we can align there. Now, the problem tends to be sometimes these people just want to argue and debate theology. And I'm kind of like, listen, you and I made my point, you make your point. We're not going to, we can work together on other issues that we can agree on. But if you just want to like throw shade and like maybe, and then almost bring in Islamic phobic tropes, we're not really going to get anywhere. Right. And we just kind of like say, you have your religion, I have mine. Keep it moving kind of thing at that point, which is unfortunate, because I think that's where a lot of conversation stops, is because mm-hmm. I feel like on the right-wing Christian side, they always have this you know, they definitely want to like keep, I don't have a problem with them proselytizing, right? But at some point they've got to realize, we're not breaking this dude. he's not becoming Christian, but we agree on some of the, especially what's going on in the public schools today. This like whole the sexuality, the sexual ethics, and things about gender and all these things. Everybody can get on board with that. And the thing is, not everyone is going to be fortunate enough to either send their kids to some like religious school or home, or have the bandwidth to homeschool their kids, which I understand is a lot of work. It's not just some easy thing, right? For everybody, right? Or for Muslims to make hijrah, it's some, a recent guest of mine advocates for, right? So I think that's where we should be working with these groups. And I think it feels like the only Christian groups that tend to want to work with others are these super watered down liberal Christians that you see, and they're starting to accommodate some of this stuff in their congregation. And the thing of it is, like, that's not really going to help us at the end of the day.
Yeah, I think we're putting our own personal comfort above the mutual search for truth. And to give an example, I mean, a lot of Muslims like to have interfaith events with, the UU Church, Unitarian Universalist, with, the female rabbis. And, so by virtue of being a female rabbi, that places you in sort of the liberal camp. It's easy. It's the easiest form of interfaith dialogue you can do. Nobody really wants to sit down with the Baptists, right? Or other groups, even though we probably share at least a few things in common as regards some of these social issues. I can think of several of our imams and scholars who have found ways to ally with the left on the issues they agree with them on. Why am I not seeing on the other end of the spectrum scholars, imams, etc., allying with, let's just say, for example, some pro-life forces? Now, everyone's very quick to say, but Islam, is very nuanced and all of it. Islam is nuanced in this issue, and then again, it is not nuanced. It's not nuanced from the point of view of, if your motivation for seeking an abortion is fear of poverty, fear of inconvenience, this is not the right time, etc. It is not permissible, no matter what time of the pregnancy it is, because Allah says, "Do not kill your children for fear of poverty," and numerous other things, right? Numerous other proof texts. So, and then we're told in the Quran that on the Day of Judgment, the female infant buried alive will be asked, will ask, for what crime was I killed? And unless you're telling me that we as a humanity have managed to completely extinguish infanticide from the face of the earth, I would argue that is comparable to what we're doing today. It just has a surgical veneer, right? So it seems like it's a quote unquote healthcare matter, right? So now this euphemism is coming up of abortion is healthcare. Well, it ain't healthcare for the fetus that's being killed. Healthcare is supposed to ameliorate your condition, not kill someone in the process. But the problem is that we don't see that person as a someone. And Islam, the verse that's tragically the verse that is always brought up, or hadith that's brought up to talk about the permissibility of abortion, I believe it's drawing our attention to this miracle that's unfolding in the womb that we would have had no access to if not for Allah describing it to us.
You're talking about the time of the soul entering?
The clot, and then it becomes and Allah is kind of describing this process that that you didn't really see at the time. So it's actually a point of introspection, the same way that Allah kind of talks about the creation and the horizons and do you not see, and the signs that are in yourselves. Why do we take this beautiful phenomenon that's being described and use it as a proof text for ending a life, right? Now you might say, well, the ruh is not in it yet. Okay, well, having life and having a ruh is two different things. Something can have a life and not have a ruh yet, but it's still a life. And the Sharia protects life, right? So, so when people talk about, well, you know, Islam allows abortion, well, it never allows abortion for that motivation. It's always concerned with
Correct.
what is the motive.
Yeah, right.
And so if the motive is, you know, the health of the mother, which by the way is extremely rare, but it happens. Okay, well then I don't see how it would matter whether it's 60 days, 90 days, 3 months, 4 months, 8 months. It's the life of the mother. So I've never understood why the timeline is such a big deal, because it's the motivation for the abortion that is the foremost issue at hand. And I would advise people to look up the fatwa of that Khalid Abu Fadl gave on his website for a woman, a very compassionately worded and just a beautiful fatwa to this woman who was asking about should she have an abortion. Just look at that, look at what he says. He talks about the different opinions. He says there's no one yardstick. There's even different opinions on when the ruh is blown in.
Right.
You know, so it would seem to me that on such a momentous question as whether A, there's a life, which we should acknowledge there is, B, whether there's a ruh, do you want to take a chance of being wrong? And the consequence of being wrong is that there is a life that was ended wrongly. I'm not a fan of ijtihad on this issue because it's such a momentous issue if you're wrong.
Right.
You know, it's not like...
So with the cat. So before we get, so one of the reasons you mentioned a point about why our leadership is so fine and it's so normative to align with more left-wing views is because, to be brutally honest, the loudest voices in our community sometimes are female activists. And because of, you know, Me Too and mansplaining and all these issues, they are essentially, I feel like a lot of our our religious elders are bullied into this kind of submission by these characters. So therefore, they would never align with anybody because you've got people out here saying that based on who you like, they define what faith is based on their own like parameters. I think one individual recently, not recently, but quoted as saying, like, if you are in Texas and you vote for Ted Cruz, you should question your Islam. No, I'm not a fan of Ted Cruz, but who you vote for, unless you're one of those. Now, you got some groups of Muslims who believe that voting in and of itself makes you a disbeliever. I'm not talking about those guys, but or gals, but like who you vote for, like Ted Cruz. Like, so if voting for Ted Cruz is fine, is makes you a kafir or question your Islam, but voting for Beto is perfectly legit. That doesn't. Now we are now introducing like new things into the faith, and these things, unfortunately, I got to give a shout out to my man Imam Mark Manley, because he's one of the guys right now that's been speaking out on these kind of issues. But you know, he's running a small masjid in Southern California. You don't see him invited to the major platforms. You got the ICNA convention going on in Baltimore this weekend. I'd be curious to know what kind of, if any of these views are even brought up. So I think that's where a lot of people are, are going down this road. I think they're being bullied. I think they're we're being afraid of being labeled misogynist, et cetera, various labels. And that's why, number one, you see that. With regards to the issue of abortion, and I mentioned this on Facebook as well.
Can I just respond to that little piece?
Sure. Yep.
Okay. I would disagree. I don't think they're bullied by those super ultra left female voices in our community. I think it's easier to ally with the liberals because the liberals have done those interfaith dialogues with us.
Okay.
Have accepted us. Well, they accept us to a point, and then that's what I want to say. If we really allowed our full Islam to shine, they would meet up against the wall, right? But I think we're comfortable with them because they've stood up for us on the Muslim ban and all of these items. Whereas the right wing, to be honest about its monsters that it has been full of Islamophobia. Now, Islamophobia can look different ways, right? They're afraid of Islam because they think that what happened on 9/11 was Islam. Now, if that was Islam, I would be afraid of Islam as well, right? But here's the thing. It's much easier to change a right winger, their mind about Islam, than it is, I think, to convince a left winger why a Muslim might not want to teach their kids about or teach them a pro masturbation, a sex ed curriculum, heterosexual acts, etc. It's much harder to convince them on that than it is to convince the right wing that we're not a bunch of terrorists, etc. And I would just point you to Joram van Claveren. I mean, he was one of the biggest Islamophobes in Holland, where my grandfather was from. And he, just by virtue of being someone who wanted to learn and know, he reached out to Dr. Winter. Can you imagine if Dr. Winter had been like, responded the way some of these people want you to respond to Richard Spencer? Oh, I can't have you on my show. I don't want to talk to you. You're a bigot. I can't affiliate with you or talk to you at all. He responded to him. He answered his questions. I'm sure some of the questions were hurtful or downright wrong, but right. Dr. Winter was able to convince him. So we have examples of people, right wingers, very extreme right wingers, who see the light, and some of them even become Muslim. But what we're dealing with on the left is a much more entrenched kind of religion. And it is a kind of religion because if you dismiss their creed, you are a heretic and you must be burned at the stake. And I'll give you an example. There was a couple, and the man was Muslim and the wife was not Muslim, and on the liberal end of things. And when I let her know, she loved me as a Muslim, loved me. But when I let certain views come forth that were informed by my Islam, it was, you're a bigot and so on and so forth. Even though I'm like, well, I'm not motivated by hatred. I could sit and eat from the same plate with these people. And I found it interesting because she could be married to someone of a different religion. She could say, no, Islam is not for me. My husband's a Muslim, but I'm not Muslim. I don't think it's true, right? That's in effect what you're saying. When you're married to a Muslim and you maintain your religion, you're able to be different and disagree, right? But somehow on this issue, she couldn't find it in her heart to disagree with me and maintain the friendship. So, there's a quote by Dave Chappelle that I wanted to get in here. Our culture has accepted two huge lies. The first is that if you disagree with someone's lifestyle, you must fear or hate them. The second is that to love someone means you agree with everything they believe, say, or do. And both are nonsense. You don't have to compromise convictions to be compassionate. Right. And that's really where the reason I'm on your podcast today is because I want to join other voices like Mobeen Vade, who is out there saying, you can be compassionate and you can have convictions that are not exactly popular right now. And it's all about how you do it. One of the problems that the pro-life movement has is that we've been characterized as just these screaming faces on a sidewalk yelling at these poor women who are getting abortions. And is it fair? No. But we have to do a better job with that because it's about our care for not only that baby inside, but the woman who's carrying it. And I think some people don't bother to get to know pro-life people. They just want to engage with the caricature. But if you meet actual pro-life people, they care for the woman. They don't want the woman to experience what's called abortion regret, which nobody talks about. There's women who are still counting the birthdays of their child that would have been. Right. There's women going into biology textbooks and realizing my child was not a clump of cells. It looked like this. So yeah, you don't have to, it's a lie that we have to agree with everyone's lifestyle, or it means that we fear them or we're bigoted. And Muslims engage in this too. We do. we're very quick to say, oh, Islamophobe, Islamophobe. And yeah, I mean, that phrase itself is I think, a little problematic.
Well, yeah, and I think a lot of times people don't know. I remember, I always point, I used to, when I used to work, I spent 12 and a half years. So I've worked in corporate America, or so, big, I spent my entire career working for like huge corporations, more or less, right? But as an engineer, I don't reveal on the show, although people they Google hard enough, they can find out. And I only don't reveal it because obviously you get doxxed by the left. They'll call your HR. But I remember when I was in the steel industry, and I worked in the metals and mining steel industry. It's a blue collar industry in Northwest Indiana, like over by Gary, like outside of Chicago. So a lot of people aren't haven't dealt with Muslims. I remember going to Juma for the first time, tell my boss he never heard of it. He's been there 30 years, like a guy in his 50s. But I remember one time, so I used to have these contractors come in and do our maintenance work in our mill. And I remember signing his invoices one day, and his name was Eric, and he was like a pipe fitter foreman from like middle of nowhere, Indiana. And he would just be like, Maheen, before I met you, I thought all Muslims were terrorists. And I was like, let me guess, Eric, but I don't think that anymore. I was like, well, I appreciate that. I was like, let me guess, Eric, you must watch Fox News. He's like, yeah, how'd you know? Just figured, but I think it was just like, we had this kind of dialogue. You got to brush. Sometimes it's like when people are automatically offended and triggered, and, you can't even ask questions anymore, because where would dude from middle of nowhere, Indiana, meet Muslims?
Right.
You know what I'm saying?
Exactly.
There was actually, I would heard about a ruling. So one of the great scholars of the 20th century, Sheikh Mohammed ibn Saleh Al Uthaymeen, he was in Saudi Arabia. He lived in the middle of nowhere in Saudi Arabia, a place called Qasim in Saudi Arabia. And he was a teacher of a lot of people like that were, many of the people that we know in our community, like Yasser Qadi, Yasser Burjas, attended his lessons, for summers when they were studying over there. And he passed in 2001, I want to say, around that time. But I remember somebody had asked him a question about, like, if there was a hujjah upon some of the Americans, like, could we say the people of the hellfire? And he started asking questions about them. And he was like, where are they from? And he was like, how could you establish a hujjah upon them, a proof that they are people of the fire, when they have access to no Islam? They're in the middle of nowhere. There's no Muslim neighbors. They're almost like what they call Ahlul Fatra. There's this whole concept of being Ahlul Fatra, right? And he's like, how could you say that? The message obviously didn't reach certain people. And just because we live in a globalized environment, I talk to a lot of people, and you meet people who aren't on social media. They're not on Twitter. They're adverse to it. They just feel it's weird and like almost like Dajjalic in a way, even though they themselves wouldn't use that term, but that's how I translated there. You know what I mean? So, how do you, and so at the end of the day, they're good people, but the left seems to want to like just pigeonhole them all. They're all bigots, and they're like this and like that. And therefore, what that does, it cuts off all communication, and there is no reason. And I still cannot figure out why Muslims who claim to believe that this is the faith from God, and they believe in the final prophet, have a problem with us talking to. And it's not like a trip like the MLI, like the Muslim Leadership Initiative, where you get to go on a vacation to like Israel and, partake on their terms, so to speak. You know what I'm saying? You know what I mean? It's just like, okay, if I meet somebody like Richard Spencer coming on my show, one of my friends told me, who's actually like well learned, he's trained in the Sharia, was like, people who claim that you gave Richard Spencer a platform, nah, it was the other way around. He gave you a platform, because look at all the views.
It does go both ways.
You know what I mean? But if you look at the comments and the likes on that video, most of those folks are there for Spencer, and they're hearing about whatever they hear about Islam, or they're probably first time maybe hearing from an Arab. And I'm not a scholar. There's some I would prefer to have a Hamza Yusuf or Omar Suleiman in my spot talking to Richard Spencer, not me, right? But I just do what I can, because sometimes people aren't willing to do it, or the opportunity isn't there, right? So, with that being said, now moving on to abortion, it seems like, and with that said, I mentioned Omar Suleiman. I had a chance to interview him for the original Yakin Institute podcast. Because I used to be the host of the OG beta version, I think, when they were first launching, like in 2017, I think it was. Did like 8 or 9 episodes. Those shows used to be available. If anyone from Yakin is listening, y'all need to put that show back out. I mean, I lost the file. If I had the file, I would put it out myself on my channel, but I don't have it. But I feel like that article on Yakin Institute that's being parroted around as like some kind of nuanced approach to abortion. I remember that interview, and I was asking Sheikh Omar Suleiman about like when you can pull the trigger. There is no carte blanche pulling the trigger on abortion. Period. You need to first of all have a reason, and it has to be cleared by a mufti. In when we're talking about Islamic guidelines, right? And like you said before, it doesn't matter if it's like a week after conception, right? You can't pull the trigger without a valid reason.
Yeah.
Or and then getting it cleared by the mufti. Now, I don't know what the if rape falls into it. I had a conversation with a brother by the name of Gareth Bryant from New York City, who told me there's about, I think he said their data shows about 5% of abortion cases are like rape or incest. And I'm not sure. And I think we were talking and we were kind of discussing this issue of like, well, the child still has no fault for being conceived out of rape, right?
Right. Yeah.
At the same time, it's hard to fault a woman to carry that child to birth because of the traumatic experience of the rape.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I'm saying? So I think, and I don't know if I recall that rape might be a legitimate reason under the Sharia, but I'm not sure. I can't. I should have looked that up, but I didn't have a chance to. You can.
Yeah. Well, in Khalid Al Bufadl's, very extensive fatwa that he gave, he says no. Now he didn't say no. He was very pastoral about it, but I think one of the big issues with
he says no, it's not permissible to have it if you were raped. You carry the baby to term.
It is still a protected life that has already started.
Gotcha.
And so forth.
Right.
But I think one of the problems with going about it, I understand the motivation of wanting to outlaw, elective abortion, let's just say, for pro-life people, because if you truly believe that this is like murder in the sense that ending a life that has started, that is, developing at a rapid rate, has its own DNA, so it's not the body of the mother, it has its own DNA. Mm-hmm. But there's the whole thing, there needs to be, preferably beforehand, a societal, a campaign to convince people to change a campaign of morality, right? Like one of the reasons why prohibition failed is because people weren't there yet. Like they wanted to drink, right? And so people were making in their bathtub, and Women's Christian Temperance Union got it, illegal, but that didn't last. And when the Prophet ﷺ prohibited alcohol, it was gradual, and people were convinced, and they had there was a system and a teacher and a convincing message that made them realize, I don't even want to do this, even if it was someone said it was legal, right? So I just think there's an education that has to happen with abortion, but because we have a group that wants to make it illegal and another group that wants to make it legal no matter what, just like abortion on demand, we're having this legal conversation when we haven't had the ethical conversation. And we need to have the ethical conversation because a lot of people think that there's only a religious argument against abortion, but there's actually a group on Facebook, Secular Pro-Life. These are people who don't believe in religion, and they have somehow come to the conclusion that this is one of the biggest moral tragedies of our lifetime going on under our nose, and we just don't realize it. So people should familiarize themselves with the arguments that have been made by secularists, because those are actually very useful. And in the pro-life movement, one of their issues is they're always using throwing Bible verses at everybody. And it's like, not everybody believes that, bro. Like you can't,
Right,
You can't
right.
argue it. It's tone deaf. So so I think we need to set about just having that moral conversation first. Um, and I try to do that with people, you know,
Hmm.
because I think it's really important.
So my wife is I think I told you she
Yeah.
works in healthcare, women's health specifically. And I think the concern seems to be that if there's a full overturn of Roe v. Wade, what is the because there are many cases. So I've heard about, I guess, every potential legit like scenario for the most part. Although one case she told me, I wasn't kind of like, I don't know if that would fly. So we could
Mhm.
run but that in that case was, I think there was a patient who had a condition where she had a condition where she was constantly throwing up for like, I think it became like weeks on end. And it was something that she was preventing her to go to work. I think she was in education, so she had to be on. So it was not her.
Hyperemesis.
Maybe
Hyperemesis.
maybe that's what it's called. Yeah,
Mhm.
and the intent of this woman was to obviously have a baby, right? But she had exhausted all her leave, and
Mhm.
she was going to be let go. And if she was going to be let go, she would lose her income and eventually be homeless, etc., etc. And so she had to have an abortion. And the idea is now, obviously, if you just look verbatim at the Islamic perspective, the Quranic verse, you would say, "Don't kill your children out of poverty," right? Which she
Mhm.
did,
For fear of
but
poverty,
this
right?
isn't a not. But this is a maybe non-Muslim woman, but also under the
Mhm.
pressure of, I might be homeless. I don't know if I have other kids. I don't know if she had other kids and whatnot, etc., etc. But like, there isn't an infrastructure in place to handle a case like that, right? Um, Unfortunately, I don't know what kind of data exists, because I asked her, I asked my wife, like, what kind of percent? Because like, I know there's the 5% rape, um, but how many are true medical cases? And we have to, and I think it's hard to like decipher, because they might include mental health as like, oh, I just have PTSD because I got knocked up by and my dad's gonna kill me, so therefore I got to get an abortion, kind of thing.
Right.
You classify it as
Yeah.
mental health, but there are legit physical issues, and I think sometimes what happens is that like the system, whatever legislation passes, I think there's cases of like, worse, okay, it's 2 a.m, and the mother gets rushed in. Again, a mom who wants to have a baby gets rushed in, and they have to make a decision. They're like, the doctor's gut feeling is
Mhm.
if we don't do this, the mom's gonna die, right? Like
Mhm.
soon, right? They can't guarantee it, because a lot of medicine is like, you have to empower the doctor. Now the problem is liability laws for like obstetrics and gynecology has the, like, I think one of the worst liability insurance as far as most expensive in America. Um,
Mhm.
so therefore they are just like, and now you're damned if you do, damned if you don't. I think the concern is if they are, um, and I think that most physicians are not actually incentivized to perform abortions. To be honest, I think because, and the law overturns it, it'll incentivize them even less if they feel like that's the right call. Does that make sense?
Right.
From a health point of view. So, and I don't know what the pro life, I don't know what the law. And generally speaking, I would assume that most laws today would have some level of nuance, right?
Right. Right.
Um, but I definitely, so now the problem in America with Roe v. Wade and pro-choice is that the default mindset is that it's okay to have the abortion carte blanche. You don't need a damn reason.
Yeah.
That is
Right.
current status quo, right?
Right.
And that's because there is no moral compass or anything driving anything.
Mhm.
It's all my body, my choice. That's the paradigm. Um,
Yeah.
but there has to be, but the flip, we can't just flip it on its head either and just say, no, you have the baby no matter what, because there
Yeah.
obviously are cases where you
Yeah.
you have to make a judgment call. Because what kind of, like, I would hate to have to make a judgment call as a
Mhm.
husband on whether my child lives or my wife lives, if I get to pick one.
Yeah.
And sometimes people
Yeah.
are forced with that decision, and it's a really difficult decision.
Mhm.
Or even if it's the some mothers, when they're and she was explaining to me some of this late term stuff, right? A lot of times she's like, just thinking about, she was explaining, logically speaking, this late term stuff, there are, the problem is the politicians are using, like, this one politician was caught on tapes that literally saying that you can abort the baby like right before birth, right? Which obviously is hideous. But which mother carrying a baby to almost full term is going to want to terminate the pregnancy at that point? That, like, I don't see how that makes sense.
Well, it has happened.
Okay.
It might not make sense to you and I.
Okay.
There was a controversial, I think I might have frozen, but can you still hear me?
You did freeze, and I wonder why. Yeah, I wonder. Yeah, your internet may have just dropped off, but whatever.
Well, I'll keep talking.
You keep talking. That's the most important thing is I can hear you.
Right. Audio. I just lost my train of thought.
We were talking about the whole issue of like late term abortions, and like, you know, I was questioning, like, what's the rational reason for a woman to pull the plug on a pregnancy?
No, I was going to mention that there's this very controversial group called Progressive Anti-Abortion Uprising, I think it's called.
Okay.
On Facebook. And it's interesting. They have very liberal politics, but they're pro-life. And one of the activists engaged in something illegal and stopped the medical waste disposal truck. And somehow she was given these fetuses that had been aborted. Mm-hmm. And if you look up #JusticeForThe5, you will learn about these 5 fetuses that she kept and took and wanted to save, apparently to try to have it investigated, because some of them were late term, and late term abortions are supposedly illegal. So you have to ask how many people are performing late term abortions in areas where it's illegal, and will our pro-life friends who are all about the law agree to have an autopsy and investigation if abortions are being performed in places where it's illegal. Now, of course, it should never be illegal to have an abortion to save the life of the mother. That being said, it's very rare. And we have to parse out, you can remove a child from the womb and not kill it, mm-hmm. right? If it's viable, and I think 22 weeks now, we're starting to have viability. If it is still viable, you can remove it and put it in the NICU. You know, removal does not equal killing, right, necessarily.
Yeah.
So that needs to be parsed out, number one. But yeah, I mean, it's not this idea that it's a hard decision for every woman. Look, there are women out there who have had multiple abortions that were not for medical reasons. Their partners don't want to use protection. They don't want to. It happens. And those of us who know people who worked in Planned Parenthood, have repeat just serial abortions. It happens. And I think what we need to do is really educate women that, a long time ago, they couldn't see inside the womb, right? If you could just walk around with your womb transparent, it would be amazing. And I think women who could see inside their womb wouldn't want to end what is there. We're very visual creatures, right. Human mm-hmm. beings. We're very visual creatures, which is why we're able to say, oh, it's okay if it's just a few weeks old because it just looks like a clump of cells, Yeah. But when you start to really ask a pro-choice person, like, okay, so what about 6 months, 7 months, 8 months? They get more and more uncomfortable, or they should. The ones that aren't, I don't even know how to engage with someone like that. Mm-hmm. But a lot of them become more and more uncomfortable as you go along in the pregnancy. And so my question is this: if you don't have a clear yardstick, why would you want to have this thing called abortion? And what is so magical about the birth canal that it bestows, I don't know, the right to live on someone, right? I mean, you can have a pregnancy the day before it's due, you can abort it, and the day after, oh, it's a human being now with all the rights of a human being. The fact of the matter is, it's a human being from conception. Any biologist who looks at that little creature under a microscope will say this is a human specimen. Mm-hmm. So right. If we are going to argue that humans have human rights, then we need to extend that to all humans.
Sure.
But I think a lot of people dehumanize the fetus because they're looking at how it looks, visually how it looks. And that's a real problem because a lot of bad things happen in history when people were deemed unworthy of life because of how they looked. There was eugenics, and there's a bit of a tie between eugenics and how Planned Parenthood started. We don't have to get into that, but
Yep.
you know, we really just need to start talking about these concrete issues because it's real, and these are real human beings, and you know, I was just to wrap this point up. There were liberals who were upset that this person had taken these fetuses, and they were talking about, you know, desecrating the body. These were fetuses that were destined for incineration in a medical waste disposal, along with tumors and other things. So don't pretend to me that you're concerned about human dignity. You know, it's just, yeah.
I hear you. I mean, would you be in favor of some kind of persecution for women, like having abortions with no reason? And because if the idea is, if it's murder, shouldn't they also be charged with the crime of murder?
No, there's enough indications that there are women who are pressured into abortion, reluctant about abortion. There's enough indications that I think a blanket, we're not going to prosecute women who get abortions. Okay. That is actually a stance that some pro-life organizations have taken. Nobody talks about it, but there are pro-life organizations that are like, we are totally against this. We're trying to help women. We're trying to help them, educate them, because the lives that are inside them have been so dehumanized. The way we've talked about parasites, right? I've seen them likened to parasites. I've seen women say, well, it's occupying my body, it's violating me. Well, in order to violate you, it has to be, you know, the idea of a violation is where it shouldn't. Right. And a fetus is in its natural environment. It's in its natural environment. The only violation is taking it out of its natural environment, right?
Right, for sure.
So this is part of the whole property rights, bodily autonomy argument, which is very materialistic. As a religious person, I can't identify with it because I'm on a totally different plane when it comes to talking about this, and they're coming at it from a very materialist argument, where a woman has almost like this godlike ability to decide if her child is going to live or die. Right. And that's just not something I can get on board with as a woman, right? Because we're always told you have to have a uterus to have an opinion. Well, I have a uterus and I have an opinion, and my opinion is that 63 million abortions since 1973, I believe, is crazy and unnecessary. And I also have an opinion that doesn't jive with that for a lot of people, that we do need, as Bernie Sanders says, a robust social safety net so that women don't feel like they have to do this.
Right. For sure. And obviously, I would think, we touched about it a little earlier, is that some of the pro-lifers like protest. So there are some churches in Chicago, for example, that they have a weekly protest outside of the Planned Parenthood or something. They're preaching there out of all play. You know, I'm like, how effective is that? Right? Are you really? I was talking earlier about some of the Christians I had on my show. There was one individual who he got, his brother's business got shut down. That it came back up after a year, but what got the clickbait high title was he was out there talking. He said that Planned Parenthood. He's like, I think he said something. BLM kills more people than the KKK now, or say it has. With the understanding, because of BLM being Planned Parenthood, that whole allegiance, et cetera, right? Yeah. So obviously that got headlines, and you're gonna like, I mean, some of it is just tack. Yes, if you break it down to argument, but like, it's also like, don't be an idiot.
I mean, that sounds like you're an apologist for the KKK. I don't understand how the KKK has anything to do with this.
Right. You know what I mean? So yeah, you know, so people will be like, what? Like, you know what I mean? And the facts, maybe if you're trying to say, oh, because of Planned Parenthood and all these deaths and how did the KKK do it, and you're trying to make this analogy because you're like, oh, you guys hate the KKK, then you guys should really, really hate Planned Parenthood or the BLM or whatever. Because of
that's just bombastic stuff. I mean, right. I don't think. Yeah,
it's not helpful.
But but to answer your question, I mean, there are sidewalk counselors
Right.
is what they're called.
Mm.
And some of them are very effective. I mean, I
Okay.
follow a group, I think it's called Let Them Live
Okay.
on Facebook, and they'll say, so and so, was heading into the clinic today, stopped at our table, we had a conversation with her, and over a course of days or even weeks,
Right.
they will talk to these women, and some of the women decide not to go through with it.
Right.
And so, yes, I mean, there are the people that shout and yell and are terrible. Of course, those are the ones the news are going to cover.
Yep.
But there are sidewalk counselors who are very effective. And my question is, why aren't the Muslims out there with them?
Yeah,
Why?
for sure. Absolutely. Yeah. And finally, as we said, the last topic of the day for today is really in light of what happened this past week in Texas, another school shooting, and I was not aware of your position on guns until this past week. And you talked about on Facebook how, you seem to be, you I guess you describe yourself as, and if I misrepresent, you can correct me, as an advocate for some kind of gun control reform, and that is a position, and you say that is also a pro-life position because effectively you're coming from the point of view that some kind of reform will reduce some of these incidents from happening. But why don't you just clarify your position on guns and gun control in America, and where you stand there? We can go from there.
Just like we don't let everybody have surface-to-air missiles, or rocket propelled grenade, all kind of things. We regulate that. We say that only the military should have it. There are certain types of guns that I think only the military should have. The notion that we need to hang on to our guns because we need to rebel against the government one day. Look, maybe that was okay 100, 200 years ago. Today, the government has a monopoly on violence. Okay. So, you with your AK-47, if the tanks come rolling, I'm sorry. But so it's regulating violence. That's all it is. And we're not taking away guns. People, where I live, a lot of people hunt. I just think it's common sense. And I think most Americans and a lot of people who are Republican, a lot of them actually agree that we could do a whole lot more. You look at countries overseas, and they don't have the problems we have. Why? Because they have better gun control. Now, people here don't want to turn to gun control. They want to say, oh, it's mental health issues. So are you saying that Americans are uniquely nutty? We're just uniquely crazy and Europeans and Japanese are not? No, we are an outlier on firearms. We are not an outlier on mental health. So this is a common sense issue. It's manufactured outrage. It's the NRA, I think, has all this clout. And to go back to Bernie Sanders, one of the guys that's willing to go up against this kind of stuff. Unfortunately, he's not pro-life on abortion, but I feel that my stance is consistently pro-life. And I would just urge all the listeners out there to follow on social media some of the pro-life organizations that I've mentioned. Let Them Live, Secular Pro-Life. If you want to look into Progressive Anti-Abortion Uprising, they're there. They're a bit more radical, but just follow these groups because they are out there, and you do not have to pick a side and agree with everything. I think a lot of us are in the middle, but we're seeing these groups sort of polarize and cater on both sides, Republican and Democrat, catering to their most extreme elements. So it's on us to be more vocal.
Right. When you talk about on the gun issue, because I'm happy to hear that you don't advocate, because when I hear people, my barber, I love the guy. He's been cutting my hair for 4 or 5 years now. I think 5 years almost, I think. But he is a hard, he is woke leftist as hell, right? And he posts on Instagram that how he we should get rid of all guns, period. And I was like, what are you how are you gonna do that? It's impossible, right? To me, number one, that automatically just tells me that you're not being realistic. America has a gun culture, and we have to number one, engage with that, come to that reality. If anyone tried to do it, there would be an uprising and a civil war, I think, because of how entrenched that is. Now, granted, being said, if I was given, if someone had all power, to push the button and just eliminate all guns, period, they had omniscient, basically, if Allah did it or God did it, that would probably, you just got rid of all guns, period. Boom, they're gone. That's, it's some supernatural means. I don't know. I think I'd be fine with that, because that way you're just kind of like, all right, well, we just got rid of the problem, period. Right? But that's not going to happen. That's like a pipe dream. It's not happening. People aren't turning them in. You're going to have people, making them, having their own, keep it, not registering things. I think what happened in, I want to have a conversation about like so yeah, I agree that the mental health stuff is kind of overplayed a little bit. Again, I want to point back to like what is going, but there seems to be something going on with the culture in America, because America's always been a gun culture. It's not like we weren't a gun culture 40 years ago or 30, 40 years ago. But I think it's almost like whether it's nihilism or people just not having self-worth, or like you touched upon earlier, the lack of moral compass and the secularization of everything has made people depressed, and they have anxiety and this, that, and going on.
It's definitely part and parcel. I mean, I think it's not an either or, it's a both and,
Right.
And looking at the fact that a lot of these guys, they tend to be, young, male. So we do need to ask, why is it young males? What's going on? So we need to tackle it from every angle.
Yeah.
That's gun control, that's mental health, it's everything.
Yep. And I'm an engineer by profession, and one of the things we do, and I work in this specialist in this subfield called maintenance and reliability for equipment, for assets. And whenever assets fail, we always, if we tend to have repeated failures, we tend to do something called some kind of like a root cause analysis or a root cause failure analysis. And one of the things that when you do is that you get a cross-functional team together and you start brainstorming all the potential causes without prejudgment, right? And then you kind of like analyze each case one by one, right? So the thing of it is that I don't see what, and the problem is immediately. So when the shooting happened, I think someone was grilling Ted Cruz about it the day after or the day of, and his immediate reaction was, it's the left trying to politicize the issue. And I'm just like, you're automatically jumping to a conclusion without engage. We have to at some point engage the topic, right? And I see what they're saying, but it's also, if your initial reaction is just to politicize the issue, it just tells me the concern isn't about solving the problem. It's about being right and making sure your team is on the upper hand, right? Mm-hmm. On both sides, both the pro-gun and the left side of things. But I think that you can't like, I think there has to be distinguished like what kind of guns people could have. I guess I'm okay with having the conversation. I fired AR-15s. It's an easy gun to use, although I don't know what, and I think for home defense, I mean, people want to know, why do you need an AR-15? I would say point blank for home defense, because people are how homes are getting busted into, and the people I know that have them, they keep it in their homes for a break-in. And with more and more defunding the police, you have to fend for yourself. And an AR-15, practically speaking, is just easier to aim than like a pistol or something like that. You get a shotgun. I think what needs to really change is, from a legislation point of view, is there's got to be background checks. Although people are saying that this character who did the shooting in Texas, I guess he would have passed any background checks. The other problem, I think, is, and I was speaking to, I remember at a steel industry seminar I went to a few years back, I met a guy who actually runs a gun shop in Texas. And we were talking about things, and he's like, the gun stores, you have to go through background checks when you buy at a gun store. The problem is when you go to a gun show. It's like literally I could walk into a gun show, pay some dude $400, and he'd give me something, right? No transfer paperwork. It's literally like buying something at a thrift store or a garage sale.
Right.
That's how easy it is. And so that part, I probably has to be some kind of regular. I don't know how you do it. I feel like, but I think we got to go back to having the conversations. But the idea is also look at like, where were we at culturally and morally? Like this whole like, this is where the left doesn't want to hear it. as far as the removal of God from the situation, because I'm like, what other thing has happened so significantly in the last 30, 40 years? I don't know the data, but has gun ownership like quadrupled in the last 30, 40 years? Or has it been pretty consistent? Because most gun owners I know, it's a family legacy for them. It's something they learned from their pappy shooting deer
Right.
in Indiana or
Right,
something,
right.
right? You know what I mean?
Here too, yeah.
So, I mean, understanding that, and then we have to say like, and then if we want to like limit, yeah, I agree. I mean, you probably don't need a Uzi in your house. You know what I'm saying? Like semi-automatic machine guns, and argue, yeah, and you're right. I fully agree with you. The purpose of the Second Amendment to bear arms against a tyrannical government, like the United States military. I was listening to a podcast the other day where one of the guests was articulating how the United States government military is probably so sophisticated that they have what it takes to defend itself against nukes.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And because of what the amount of money that's been poured in, so a machine gun, an Uzi, like you said, we don't know about tanks. They could literally press a button and erase my neighborhood within within nanoseconds if they wanted to, right?
And the idea that I'm going to have my AR-15 and I'm going to be like, don't tread on me, and I'm going to be able to just stop the government, it's ridiculous. It's an inflated sense of ownership of the government.
Right.
But it tells you that some people feel very, they feel this inflated sense of importance. I think they are clinging, you know, as Obama said, to guns. But what they really need to be worried about is what goes on in the back rooms between lobbyists and their, you know, that's the real takeover of government right there. And that's why Bernie got a lot of people on the right to actually vote for him, because I talked to a lot of them when I was texting for his campaign.
Right.
So anyway, you know, a lot of us just feel politically homeless, but I think if you're Muslim, that's a good place to be.
Yep.
Khuraba and all of that. You're not going to complete. If you agree with the entire Republican platform or the entire Democratic platform entirely, I would be worried. I would be worried as a Muslim. Now, I know a lot more Muslims that fit the latter description, where I cannot distinguish between your views and the Democratic Party. I literally can't find anything that you would depart from them on. I think that's the bigger problem. But, you know, we have to be grounded in our religion. We have to learn our religion. And then we can see the world through our religion. And if we don't do that, we will latch on to other languages that help us to see the world and alive. That's what happened. You know, we joke about the people who are woke. Well, they've found a language that's very effective in explaining the world around them. For them, it works, but it requires them to really adopt some troubling stances that are not in line with Islam. So yeah, there's a lot to tackle nowadays.
Sure. So if people want
to, for hosting this conversation,
absolutely, yeah, no, it was a blast. I hope people get some benefit out of it. I do apologize. I think your video was staggering throughout the second half of the show.
I'm up here in upstate New York in the hills in the sticks, so that's my excuse.
Right. So no, it was clean throughout the first half of the show. They kind of like staggered throughout and on and off for being freezing, but at least we got the audio. That's the most important thing. If people want to reach out to you or learn more about the work you're doing, what's the best way for them to find out?
Sure. So I am on Substack.
Okay.
I am on Facebook. I am not on Twitter a lot, but those are the ways that they can find me.
What's your Twitter? I look forward.
My Twitter is The Civil Muslim. I used to have a blog with that name.
Okay.
But those were in the days of blogging. Remember those days?
Yep. Zenga.
Yeah.
Yeah. The Civil Muslim. And then Facebook. You're okay with people engaging you on Facebook?
Yeah, totally.
Okay.
Yep. Find me on Facebook.
They won't find you by your real name, though.
You can.
You can?
Yeah,
okay.
You can.
Okay. Gotcha. All right. So. They can find you there, and then your blogs, and I'll link your blog and your Substack
All
um,
right, inshallah.
in the link. So appreciate listeners out there. If you have any questions or comments, you can email me at info@sultansandSneakers.com. If you want to support this channel financially, you can do so at patreon.com/Sultans and Sneakers. I would love to hear everyone's thoughts on this episode. And if you have any guest recommendations, maybe there's someone you know that wants to bring a different viewpoint than what Tricia brought today, I'd be happy to engage them. With that being said, for my special guest, chaplain Tricia Pethic, I'm your host, Mahin the podcaster, signing off.